want to, yeah. So
we wait 2 minutes just in case.
Yeah, we 2
Okay.
minutes, yeah. And the two presenters are here also, right? Shige, are you there?
Shige, yeah.
And Kung.
Yes, I'm here. It's Kung from VIM.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Everyone's there. Very good. And
Okay,
we are ready with the slides as well.
So, hello.
Yes,
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, maybe we can start now. So we're right on time.
Okay.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I hope all of you are keeping safe and keeping well in these uncertain times. In this session, we're going to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on the business sector. As you know, the COVID-19 outbreak is a major shock to all the economies in Southeast Asia. And to contain the spread of the virus, some measures have been put in place, such as lockdowns, travel restrictions, social distancing. But all these measures are, also had an impact on the economy, slowing economic activities and affecting negatively all kinds of businesses and their employees as well. So under this situation, it is very important to gather data and information through surveys to identify the major impacts on enterprises' supply chains, the markets, revenues, employment conditions, and all these results can help identify targeted support to businesses to enhance survival of the business sector and also employment recovery. So in this session, we are going to learn about the results of very important surveys that have been conducted in ADB on the impact of COVID-19 on SMEs in Southeast Asia. And we're going to learn insights also for improving policy support for the region, given the results of the surveys. So the way the session is structured, we're going to have two presentations of around 15 minutes each. And then we will have a Q&A session after of around 20 minutes. So the first presentation is going to be delivered by Shigehiro Shinokaki, who is a senior economist from ERCD. And he's going to present the COVID-19 impact on micro, small, and medium enterprises in developing Asia, with a particular emphasis on the Philippines, because he has done a very good survey on SME, on COVID impact on SMEs in the Philippines. And also he will discuss implications for post-crisis actions. So, Sige, yeah, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So now, so can you hear me? So actually, I have some problems about internet connection.
Okay. I can hear you very well, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just I try to open my presentation, but can you see my PowerPoint slide?
Yes, we can see the PowerPoint slide. Asian economy acted quickly.
Yeah, we are on slide 2, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now we
see the title.
Yeah.
Okay. So good afternoon, and thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about our study. Relatively soon after this pandemic, we launched these rapid MSME surveys to assess their impact in 4 countries: Indonesia, Laos PDR, the Philippines, and Thailand. The surveys were done from March to May, followed by the second surveys in the same countries from August to September. So today, I'd like to highlight some key findings from these surveys, together with the follow-up survey result in the Philippines. Okay, so first of all, let me summarize Asian countries' responses to COVID-19 in brief. As indicated in this table, many countries quickly moved to curb the economic contraction caused by the COVID-19 pandemic through large-scale economic stimulus packages. So among several policy instruments, debt finance was most widely utilized to support MSMEs, which was followed by tax relief and employment support and support for business retention. For debt finance, central banks launched several liquidity support measures for banks to facilitate financing MSMEs, together with offering the loan repayment deferrals and loan restructuring for MSMEs. So during the first 2 months, after the COVID-19 outbreak, MSMEs shortly cut back production and service delivery because of compressed demand and supply disruptions. As you see this figure, we saw immediate shutdowns of business in most MSMEs in the Philippines and the Laos PDR, and less than half in Indonesia and Thailand. And the domestic demand was dropped in 40% of MSMEs in Thailand and the Laos PDR, and 30% in the Philippines and Indonesia. So supply disruption was faced by more than 30% of MSMEs in Thailand and the Philippines, and less than 20% in Indonesia and the Laos PDR. So this shows 6 months after the outbreak in the Philippines, for example. As you see, MSME business environment has moderately improved. In March and April, about 70% of MSMEs suspended their operations relatively soon after the strict lockdown measures imposed. But in August and September, the number of MSMEs that closed the business sharply decreased. So instead, Philippine businesses started reopening. So we could say the Philippine economy has moved to the recovery stage. So however, a drop in domestic demand on MSME products and services has expanded further, so especially in small and medium-sized enterprises. So during the first 2 months, MSME's revenue has been sharply decreased. As you see the blue arrows, so larger number of MSMEs faced over 30% revenue decrease soon after the outbreak in March. But in April, no revenue MSMEs sharply increased, caused by temporary business closures in Indonesia, Thailand, and Laos PDR. The majority of MSMEs in the Philippines faced immediate no revenue in March, caused by the strict lockdown measures. Laos PDR also faced a very sharp increase of no revenue MSMEs in April due to the complete lockdown during that month. So however, in the Philippines, this damaged income of MSMEs has largely improved in August. So as you see, no revenue MSMEs decreased sharply. However, it's about 40% of MSMEs faced over 30% revenue drop, so with expanding trend. For employment, MSMEs during the first 2 months, as indicated in the left-hand side, So around 60% of MSMEs had no change of employment after the outbreak. So for the remaining 40%, reduced workforces in the Philippines, Thailand, and Laos PDR. By contrast, around 60% of MSMEs reduced employees after the outbreak in Indonesia. So overall, in the right-hand side, we could see that temporary staffing cut was a major action by MSMEs, which was followed by reduced working hours of employees in all 4 countries. So also, we could find work from home was not a popular arrangement by MSMEs in all countries. So although every country promoted this arrangement. In the Philippines, as indicated in the left-hand side, MSMEs that reduced employees decreased in August for micro enterprises especially, but in the same condition for small firms, and rather increased for medium-sized firms. So most micro enterprises reported no change of employment in August, so suggesting their employment is returning to the normal condition. So more concretely, MSMEs with temporary staffing cut decreased in August. Decreased in August, especially sharp decrease in micro enterprises. So as mentioned, work from home was not a serious option for MSMEs in the first 2 months. But right-hand side, so MSMEs arranged work from home have gradually increased toward August. Okay, so this slide shows the total wage payments to employees by MSMEs in the first 2 months. As you see the long bars, so more than half of MSMEs suspended wage payments to employees after the outbreak in Indonesia and the Philippines. Meanwhile, so more than 1/3 of MSMEs reported no change of monthly wage payment in Thailand and Laos PDR. In the Philippines, the larger number of MSMEs suspended wage payments relatively soon after the outbreak in March. But MSMEs with no wage payments decreased sharply in August. However, so MSMEs cutting over 30% of wage gradually increased, so especially in small and medium-sized enterprises toward August. So in the first 2 months, MSMEs faced serious cash flow problems in all 4 countries. MSMEs in every country reported a serious lack of funds to retain their business, especially Indonesia, among others. So as you see this figure, Philippine MSMEs faced a serious lack of funds to retain business in March and April, especially in micro enterprises. But this condition has moderately improved in August. So MSMEs with already no cash and savings decreased sharply in August, so especially micro enterprises. So, and those who reported funds to be run out within 3 months at the time of the survey, so also decreased in August. So however, so MSMEs with funds to be run out in 6 months, so increased in August, especially so medium-sized enterprises. So for funding condition in the first 2 months, MSMEs faced much difficulty in raising sufficient working capital to survive in all 4 countries. They normally never change their conventional funding approach. So even if the crisis situation, that is, so highly relying on their own funds and so borrowing from family, relatives, and friends to survive during the pandemic. In particular, so Indonesia much highly so relied on informal sources to survive. And getting credit from banks was limited for most MSMEs, despite several new lending support measures by the government. So 6 months after the outbreak, most MSMEs in the Philippines still highly rely on their own funds and borrowing from family, relatives, and friends to survive. But towards September, their dependence on informal financing sources has decreased. So instead, access to bank credit has gradually increased for MSMEs. We also asked the MSMEs for their desired policy measures to survive during the COVID-19 pandemic. So among 21 policy options, most MSMEs strongly desired financial support measures from the government in all 4 countries in the first 2 months after the outbreak. So more concretely, so over 90% of MSMEs desired zero interest rate and collateral-free loans across all countries observed. And subsidies, cash transfer, and grants ranked second for Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand. So this trend has not been significantly changed 6 months after the outbreak. Okay, to sum up, so overall, so Asian economies have gradually shifted to recovery stage, but devastated business environment has yet to be fully recovered. So continued sharp drop in demand and revenue still remain. The employment conditions was mixed by firm size, but MSME is preparing a new business environment under the new normal. They started introducing work from home arrangements. So however, in case of the Philippines, so working capital shortage in 3 to 6 months has risen. So this elevated MSME's demand on further financial assistance from the government, so especially addressing loan repayments and tax payments. So we still see this uncertain environment of containing COVID-19. So given these different coping abilities of this impact by firm size, government need to pay more attention to phased approach and differentiated policy measures by firm size and by sector. So now it is time for the government to consider optimal approach, not impeding national revenues and not increasing budgetary burdens in the post-COVID-19. Okay. So this is just for your information. So my discussion is based on this Asia SME Monitor 2020 publication. But the follow-up survey result covering until the month of September is not included in these publications. The follow-up survey reports will be prepared separately, and so I will let you know once prepared. Okay, so thank you very much. So I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Sige, for the insightful presentation. Yeah, it's very interesting to see the evolution over time, no? Since the right after the pandemic and then later in August, where things are slowly recovering. So there is some hope for our business sector to actually continue that trend of recovery towards the end of the year. And I take note of the differentiated approach that is needed according to the firm size, the sector, and I would say also by region, especially for big countries like the Philippines or Indonesia. Regional differences are quite important as well. The private sector that does not perform equally in all the regions in the Philippines, for instance. Well, now we're going to move to the next presentation. The second presentation is going to be delivered by Kwon Nguyen from Vietnam Resident Mission, his principal country economist. And he's going to present COVID-19 impacts on SMEs in Vietnam. So thank you. You can, I'll give you the floor, Kwon.
Thank you, Maria. Can you please help me to up my presentation first?
Yeah, I believe Bernard or Dulce, you are going to show up the slides of Kwong?
So share his slide.
Okay.
Okay, let me see.
No, we can share the slide, no problem. Go ahead and
Yeah, can you please? Yeah.
you will share the slide, don't worry.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me first introduce myself. Where is it then?
Yeah, we can see the presentation on the screen.
Oh, okay.
Can you see it?
But I can't see it in my TV.
Okay.
At my size.
Okay, I at least I can see it on my computer.
I see. So I do it. Is anyone can help me to move to the next slide?
The next slide, yeah.
Okay. I can do it by myself. Okay. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for the hiccups. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Kuang Bo. Is international consultant for the Green Finance TA 9621. And I'm present this one on behalf of Mr. Minh Quang Nguyen. He's a principal economist of VIM, Vietnam Resident Mission, who is on the mission today. So you know that at the end of May, we started thinking that we need to have a look at the COVID-19 impact on SME in Vietnam. So that's why VIMs and Association of Vietnam Association of SME and Research Group of Institute of Interior Affairs started this survey. And let me briefly show that it is like the contents of presentation. Let me firstly touch on the background on COVID-19 in Vietnam and why we're doing the survey on the SME and what area in what sector of SME we are doing. And we will, the third part, we're looking at the key variable or factors affecting on the SME performance in terms of revenue, profit, and like a business decision, like a labor at the SME. And the first part, we are talking about the SME responses to recent Vietnamese government initiative or policy. And the last part, as usual, it would be a quick recommendation and next step. You know that COVID-19 come at a surprise to Vietnam as well. So we actually in Vietnam, we have a two phase of COVID-19. The first phase started in mid-March and it's last for more than a month up to 26th of April. Basically at that period, Vietnam was shocked. So basically the immediate policy was a nationwide lockdown. You know that the social compulsory social distancing as well. So, but in that period, the good luck is that Vietnam has no mortality rate. So after May 1st, Vietnam opened a little bit, and like a tourist sector have initiated is like a package for encouraging people to travel, like a Vietnamese traveler to Vietnamese places, something like that. But unfortunately, by mid July, the COVID-19 outbreak again in the central part of Vietnam, which is in Da Nang, and is immediately affected, I think, 5 neighboring provinces. And at that time, Vietnam have the first time experience like high mortality of those patients basically in happen in hospital in Da Nang and Hue provinces, and the immediate lockdown and compulsory social distancing have been introduced to those affected provinces. I can give you a figure that by the end of the first quarter, Vietnamese GDP have been reduced by 2.8%, and even deteriorated further by the end of the second quarter. Another 1.8 percentage negative growth happened. So after that, 8 million workers have been left, or 6 million a million employees have been cut half of their working shift as normal. And the latest one on the COVID-19 in Vietnam is the figure that by 3rd of November we have more than 1,200 cases infected. Among of them we have 35 deaths. In general, I think that Vietnam is still lucky, and even we have the two phases of the COVID as I described above. But I think that the COVID-19 impact in Vietnam is still much less than other neighboring countries. Let me move to the next one. The reason we are doing the survey on the COVID-19 on the impact of SME, because we think that first of all, SME is a very important sector whereby a lot of employees have been happen. According to statistics by 2019, SME in Vietnam contribute to 47% of GDP, and also contribute more than 40% of the budget for the government, and generate at least 9 million employees. But you see that because of the COVID-19, we really think that this statistics come from the Bureau of New Enterprises Registry of the Ministry of Planning and Investment in Vietnam. By the end of July 2020, we have more than almost 64,000 registered companies have been closed. That one is 11% higher than that of compared to 2019. Out of the 64 registered company to close, there are 33,000 registered to temporary close. That means 40% higher than that of 1920. So, in a nutshell, I would like to say that the COVID-19 have impacts on Vietnamese economy. Now let me touch on the survey. First of all, I think that in this quick survey, whereby we want to see the harsh impacts of COVID-19 on three sectors: tourism, logistics or transportation, and small retail businesses. And the way we do it, our survey is we ask the Association of SME of Vietnam and the Institute of Interior Affairs Research Group of that, doing the direct interview and direct visit. Luckily that they started the survey before the outbreak of the second phase, so they still can visit a few provinces. So we have done the survey on the tourist SME in the 5 provinces. Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, Bà Rịa Vũng Tàu is in the south, and Cần Thơ also in the south, and Khánh Hòa in the central part. In terms of logistics, we have done the survey in the 6 provinces, including Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, Hải Phòng and Quang Ninh in the north, Da Nang and Khánh Hòa actually in the central part. And on the small retail SME, we also done in 5 provinces. Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, Haiphong, and Quang Ninh in the north, and Khai Hoa in the central part. So in terms of the scope of our survey, we have like for the tourist sector, we have contacted 5,522 SME. Out of it, we got 300 eligible responded questionnaire. Among that, we have the breakdown in terms of medium, small, and micro, small. And in terms of logistics, we also done more than 1,000 with 350 fully eligible questionnaire. And the breakdown is on the slide. The timing for all of us, I think for the second, the logistic and small retail business have been done from 27 July up to 27 September. So let me go through the results of our survey. As you see on the screen, basically you see that we have before we want to see the impacts of the COVID-19 on SME in 2020. So the way we do it, we want to test the performance of the SME in 3 sectors in the period from 2017 to 2019. So as you can see that on the SME with the revenue below like 7 billion Vietnamese dong, which is equivalent to $300,000 US, have been reducing over the period. In 3 sectors: transportation, small retail, and tourist business. One of the reasons is that the government have issued the law on support for the SME in June 2017. So a lot of red tape have been cut, and that's why. And I think another reason I must emphasize that because of the economic of scale, so the SME itself to find out that, okay, is it better to operate with the annual revenue above 300,000 US dollar or 7 billion. So that's why you see the number of the SME with the annual revenue above 7 billion Vietnamese dong have been increased cross board in 3 sectors. The next one, I want to show you that in the tourist sector, if you have a quick look at that one, you will see the heavy impact of the COVID-19 on the tourist sector SME. The first columns here basically is the revenue, the first revenue of the first quarter in 2019, and it has been reduced by more than 60% in the first quarter of 2020. Similar, we also have the data for April and May of 2 years to compare to see the harsh impacts of the COVID-19. We also have the next slide to illustrate the impact of of the tourist sector SME on each of the factors, where in terms of goods sold, in terms of production expenses, labor costs, enterprises costs, and etc. Similarly, I can show you the impact on the logistic SME, and you see that compared to the, I think that logistic have been more harsh impact than tourist sector in the previous slide. And the last one, I would like to show you the small retail SME impact of have been heavily affected by the COVID-19. And in the third part of our survey, we would like to see that what kinds of factor among the left-hand side 6 factor, how do they affect on the revenue and profit of SME? And let's talk about the traffic ban during the pandemic. As you know that when COVID-19 happened, the first impact, the first reaction is that the government tried to stop the movement of the transportation between the provinces. So you see that the responses from the free sector, they think that the traffic ban is a very have serious and very serious impacts on their operations. And the raw material, basically the they also have the similar impacts, bad impact on the SME performance. By you can see the responses in the serious and very serious area. And if you look at that one, you will see the impact of the response of the tourist sector is very interesting. At some point, you know, they have the high 37% of the responded to the not serious in terms of lack of material. Basically, to explain that part, because of the whole tourist sector have been heavily infected, so so that is almost the whole sector have been stalled. So that's why they have that kinds of responses. Working capital, I think we will touch on the next the following part. In the lack of employee, where I don't think that the response here is very mixed. Even they think that is serious when they're talking about the normal operation of their business, but they said the responses is a very mixed here, and they claim that basically the because of the availability of the employee in Vietnam in different sector, which is very mobile to move from one to another one. So they don't think that that would be big impact on their performance. Again, we also look at the impacts of the order cancellation on the three sector, and seriously that tradings and transportation and three sector have think that that one is very serious on their performance. And is this the last part? We want to ask the SME on what kinds of other reasons, like you know, low interest rate, conducive environment, demands of for tourists and products. How do they affect on their business? And I think that here we see quite mixed responses. And in the fourth part of this, we also ask SME about the bank loans and the restructuring of the existing bank, how difficulty they have they face in terms of serving the bank loans. And for the first part, for the first question, different or restructuring of the bank loan payment, I think that most of them, because of the interruption in the business, so they feel that the impacts on the of the restructuring on new loan would be very appropriate for them. The new loan, similar to the previous one, I think that most SME survey prefer the new loan from the banks to help them to revitalize their operations. Deferred tax and then tax holiday and reduction. It is interesting to see that, you know, the difference between differences and similarity between these two, and the reason they are similar to each other because most of SME basically, they, first of all, I don't think that they really understand the benefit of the tax holiday and tax reduction, as well as the defer of tax. And secondly, I think that they don't really understand the procedure, how to have that kind of benefit, because maybe the public announcement or public announcement or explanation about the government policy is not clear to them. So basically, they just think that okay, if they have something interest like a tax cut or tax defer, they would be okay, but they really don't understand what is it all about. And that's I think the emergency cash injection for the SME, the government actually announced a lot of policy on that one, like direct support to the labor of the SME, and most of the and I think that on the SME in 3 sectors, they are very much interested in that kind of support, but the actual figure doesn't show that they doesn't really show that why and how they can receive that kind of cash injection. So I think the compared to the previous graph, I think the answer here and the response here is very mixed. This one is to show the labor salary to support by the government, whether they have the direct support or the support through the SME. And the problem here in Vietnam, as we work with Association of SME and SME development fund, they said that the owner of SME, they usually don't prefer to receive that kind of support from the government. Even the government, even they like to have it. Because one of the reasons is that the procedure and the administrative procedure, how to claim that kinds of benefit or direct support is very unclear to them. Now let me touch on the, we also have the question on education and training of new skill, and the last one is on the online trading. I think that most SME, they like to have that kind of new training because they want to offer something to their labor, and they also, in terms of online trading, because the government have a lot of initiative, and they want to try and like a small trading business. When they do it, I think that what they do is that usually they try to offer the new way of shopping, and I think that it's very good and very fit in the trend of the e-commerce in Vietnam. So I think for the tradings and transportation, they have a thing that one is a very good strategy or initiative from the government. So let me let me touch on the last part. Is about recommendation and next step for the our survey on the SME. I think that it's clear that extra economics stimulus package should be introduced in Vietnam, because the impacts of the first package is not so clear for a few things, for a few reasons. Number one is the government, the public and the media is not clearly explain it to the beneficiary, SME and affected employee. And the second part, the second point is that we would like to see more way, new way how to help SME out of difficulties they are facing over the past 6 months. So in order to do that, I think that we are working on the SME funds credit fund at the moment, and the way to support the SME development funds, which is the government agency and the Ministry of Planning and Investment. The third point, I think that SME certainly they need a lot of financial support, but the support is not just one way or giving away, but as it should be based on a few criteria on sustainable basis. Especially, we should like to bring in the context of green financing and green resilient initiative. And during the period of our survey, I think that the SME in the three sector, they think that the green initiative is very much interesting, and they want to try to apply, especially like a transportation SME as well as the tourists. Certainly the e-commerce and media, e-commerce and online trading is a good initiative for the government to look at to have more activity on that. Now, the last 2 points here is that, as I mentioned briefly earlier, that during the period from May up to now, we are working on credit guarantee, green credit guarantee scheme with both governments, agency like a State Bank, Ministry of Finance, as well as the SME Development Fund and the Ministry of Planning Investment, and we try to have some sort of initiative or workshop on that on this topic by the end of this month at VIM as well. Lastly, I think that you know that Vietnam have been affected badly by a few typhoons in the central part of Vietnam. So I think the national disaster prone area and SME operating in that area in these provinces have feel that they should have some kinds of support on sustainable basis to strengthen their business and to be when prepared for the next disaster. So that's all I think from my presentation. Thank you. Maria?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the granular presentation about the impact of the pandemic in the SME sector in Vietnam. So now we are going to open up for questions and answers. You can write your question on the chat, or you can raise your hand if you have any question. Let me see. Okay, so there is a question that at IFAD in Bangladesh, they have interviewed 10,000 small and medium enterprises on COVID impact, and most sharply lost their revenue and laid off labor. Those with prosper and created jobs in Q2 and Q3 were those that were flexible and able to respond to changing market signals. Some involved across the ready-made garment supply chain quickly shift to PPE production for export with unprecedented revenue and export growth. Some technology startups which shifted to food systems intermediation and e-commerce also grew spectacularly. So perhaps where feasible, our investment in MSMEs should promote product service flexibility. Are there any examples in this regard in Southeast Asia? Yeah, I think it's a very good question on repurposing the manufacturing chain to also actually produce some goods that are in demand. I think in the Philippines there were some cases as well that they changed the production to PPE equipment and other items that were highly demanded during the pandemic. So I'll ask both speakers if there are similar examples also in Vietnam or in other countries.
Hello, Christine. So,
Yes.
so she gives the speaking. So actually, so our surveys also cover the analysis on these globalized companies, and MSME is involved in global supply chains and also material suppliers. And so production, so how to increase this productivity was also one of the very key issues. So among MSMEs devastated by COVID-19. So according to our survey, so relatively higher share of globalized enterprises have faced this severe impact from this COVID-19 pandemic. So for instance, these great losses of sales and revenue immediately after these quarantine measures and the pandemics appeared. So, and also we found that they have additional and separate requests to the government. So they have sought more technical support from the government, such as consultation, advisory, business development services, and also digital transformations of their businesses. So then I think they really want to boost their productivities under this new normal. So after this post-COVID-19, so then they need a special arrangement of technical assistance from the government. Especially focusing on these business development services. And also more concretely, one-stop services windows to support MSME exporters, importers. That's a top ranked desired policy measures among these MSMEs involved in global value chains. I think this is also the very good implications for designing the policy support measures by the government in Southeast Asia. That's one of the examples I thought. Thank you.
Yep, thank you very much. Is there any example in this regard from Vietnam? Sorry.
Actually, I think that in the second phase, when COVID-19 happened, a few big company, certainly is not under our surveys, where they have like international linkage. They also doing a few requests from the government on the support for the for the expat or expert come to Vietnam. I don't. I have read a few newspaper on that, but I don't think that they have resumed the production at much as possible because of not because of the government policy, but probably because of the
Yeah, I think we lost you. Yeah.
Really? Can you hear me?
Now we can hear you. It's just at the end that the line was dropped. Yeah. Now we can hear you.
Can you hear now?
Yes.
Okay. Can you hear now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
What I'm saying is that what I'm saying is that unfortunately, and I think that our survey is not touched on the production sector. But from newspaper, I think that in Vietnam we have a few big company with the which is participate in the like a global production chains, and what those company have been affected so far, basically for two things. Number one is that because of travel ban, whereby the experts could not come into Vietnam because of the government policy. So that's the first thing the government have to lift off, and they have to come up with like a special procedure for the quarantines for the expert and specialists. And the second part in the newspaper, in the news also come up is that basically is that because of the they call it supply disruption, some raw material cannot import it to manufacturing bases in Vietnam. So that's where they have a problem in, especially in the first phase of COVID outbreak. But I don't see that much news come up lately, especially after the second phase of outbreak.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. There is another question from David from Cambodia Resident Mission. To what extent should policymakers seek to support informal SMEs? For the formal SMEs, how could we use administrative data like the monthly VAT returns, bank data, payroll data, etc., to get information of large data sets that can be used to design policies and measure impacts? I think, Sige, you want to respond to this question?
Hello.
Yep.
Hello. Okay, so thank you very much for this question. I think this database is so critically important, and so monitoring the data about the business environment during and after the COVID-19. This is critically important to design the feasibility, feasible, and also more flexible policies to support the devastated SMEs and also devastated areas. And so I think these are more fundamental issues. So we need to keep monitoring all the business conditions, the environment, so for the longer time. So for instance, this follow-up surveys we are doing right now, so in 4 countries in Southeast Asia. So this is so critically important to track this all the business environment, and also it is useful to make the panel data. So maybe later years. So this kind of data will be so very much important. So for the government to analyze and understand this of what's happening during and after the COVID-19 era. So then the from our end, so also would like to continuously support the data monitoring and also monitoring the business environments about MSMEs in our DMCs. Providing more in-depth data and survey data for support government initiatives. Sorry, so that's my reaction on this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's important to continue monitoring all the data. It's not only one-time survey; it needs to be updated regularly, as you've done in the Philippines. That was updated a couple of times. I think we need to continue to do the same to gather relevant data. On the informal sector, I think it's a very good question. For instance, in the Philippines, one of the major policy support measures have been the wage subsidy that has been for the formal sector. And that has been quite successful. It was designed with the policy advice of ADB. However, that covers only the registered, the formal sector SMEs. For the informal sector is quite complicated. So it's a very relevant question whether or not we should be targeting support to informal SMEs. Is there any insight from Vietnam in this regard?
Actually, as I explained in, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, actually, as I briefly touched on during my presentation, you know that the government support is really needed for the SME, not only in during the COVID-19, but in the normal circumstances. But the problem with the Vietnam's SME is that 2 things. Number one is that we are not really, the bank, for example, they really still count on the actual collateral, not cash-based or cash flows appraisal. Number one. Number two is that especially during the COVID-19, we see that a lot of new initiative comes up, but the government doesn't have, or even the bank or tax authority doesn't have clear explanation in terms of administrative procedure, documents which SME have to collect for for availing that kinds of new initiative by the government. I think that's a big issue. So the people are joking that if you want the government subsidies, that watch television, not in the real times. So I think in terms of that, the public the point is that the public awareness of the government policy, new initiatives should be strengthened a lot in Vietnam as a good lesson during the COVID-19. That's all.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I see in the interest of time, I think we should move to the next session. But I want to thank very much both presenters to share their insights and results.
Tina, if you don't mind,
yeah.
one quick things. Because
yeah,
it's one missing important discussion here. Just I'd like to address one thing. Because there's a new normals, post-COVID-19 requires more contactless society, right? So
Yes.
governments will need to promote the MSME shift to digital transactions further. So nobody mentioned their digital transformations, but this is critically important. So we never miss it. So conventional MSME is so definitely not familiar with these digital transactions. And according to our surveys, so most MSMEs didn't use digital finance platforms to obtain the working capital. So no digital. So then the digital transformation is inevitable for any businesses so operating under the new normal. So then I think the government needs to more carefully consider the assistance, so including the digital skill training for MSME owners and employees. I think I wanted to stress this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Point well taken. And I think we're going to stop here. Thanks a lot to the interesting presentations and also the questions made. I'll pass it over to you, Bernard.
Yes, thank you so much.
Session.
Thank you so much, Christina. Thank you so much for wonderfully moderating and generating a very exciting discussion. And thank you, of course, very much to all the presenters and all the people who participated. So we can now move on to our next session. So just now we heard about how SME has been affected. The other sort of sector that has been badly affected by the COVID, of course, are the workers, right? So our next session will focus on that. So may I invite Emma, who is of course a labor economist, to moderate the next session. Emma, are you there? Can you please come up to the stage?
Yes.
Thank you
very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to moderate this session from the SERD Economist ASEAN Policy Network. And just one note, Bernard, our session 3 today is looking at labour market impacts. And the labour market isn't only about the workers. It's also about the enterprises and how they're faring. The corporates, the small and medium enterprises, it's about the self-employed as well. So Samir is going to be our first presenter today, and he's going to talk about impacts to the labour market and present some of the employment impact and poverty impact assessments that we've seen that are associated with our COVID response programs. And secondly, Sunny is going to present on Indonesia and share some of the policy innovations that Indonesia has introduced in the context of COVID. But before we kick off the session, I just wanted to give the audience a few things to think about, and we do have a poll. And the poll question number 1 is, which of the following key labour market indicators are likely to be impacted by COVID-19? We have 6 response options. I have allowed for people to select all or none, but the responses are working hours, unemployment, employment in agriculture and the informal economy, wage growth, economically active share of the population, and education attainment. So I encourage everybody who's a member of the audience today to have a look at the poll and submit your votes. Question number 2, I would like you to select the top 3. So only 3. You've got 10 options to choose from, but I want you to choose only 3. Policy instruments that are likely to be most effective in mitigating the short
We lost you there, Emma. Are you still there? So it seems that we lost Emma. Oh, she's back. Yes, I was so worried. I will have to do the hard work. Emma, can you resume? Okay. So we have the poll. It would be great if people can click on the link and answer the question. But it's okay. We have Emma. She'll get back at some point. Oh, okay. She's back.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't want to take up any more of Samir's time because he's produced a really awesome presentation. So we've got the poll there. We'll check the results after we've heard from Sunny and Samir. Without further ado, over to you, Samir. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. I'm gonna try to load up my presentation because I think Dulce kicked it out for a second to show the poll, but let's see. I hope you all can see my presentation. Can somebody say yes, and I'll make it full screen?
We can see it bright and clear, but with the old template still, you need to update the template, man. Okay, all right. No point taken. All right, so COVID-19, technology and jobs, and the survey questions that Emma put up actually is great because we've looked at some of those indicators in this analysis. So this analysis focuses on Cambodia and the Philippines. It started with the work for CPRO for Cambodia and then morphed into doing a bit more work for the Philippines for our TVET study that's coming out hopefully by December this year. And then we are expanding this work to include other countries in the region as well. So some of the key messages, I'll start with that if I don't get through the whole presentation because I've got about 30 slides, but I'll do my best to get through them. Some of the key messages, the first one, COVID-19 pandemic had unprecedented impacts on Southeast Asian labor markets, including massive job losses and rise in unemployment and decline in labor force participation, while major decline in hours worked as well. Stringent policy measures to contain the spread of the virus, although necessary, also have affected
the informal sector's potential to absorb displaced labor. And this is something about labor reallocation that I'll get into later on. Crisis also had a disproportionate impact on low productivity sectors, including construction, transportation, tourism, and wholesale and retail trade. But also it had impact on other sectors like manufacturing, finance, real estate and business services, education, and even public administration, which is surprising, but we see this in our numbers. Pandemic threatens important gains in poverty reduction as well. And I see there's new work that has come out of ERCD. Art Martinez has done some work on this, but here we're using working poverty data from the ILO. So the impact of COVID-19, of course, depends on the spread of COVID-19 at the national level, policy responses and lockdown measures, and also the underlying economic and labor market structure, right? So openness of the economy, vulnerable sectors and workers. So there's a lot of factors that determine the impact, the labor market impact. The employment and poverty impact assessment here, we've done it for Cambodia and the Philippines, as I highlighted at the beginning. There's a difference between these countries, of course, but there's also difference in terms of what kind of data we have available. But I'll try to show you some insights that are useful for other countries in the region. Some background on the pre-COVID labor market for these two countries. For Cambodia and the Philippines, high GDP growth since 2000 led to welfare improvements and reduction in poverty, but large shares of population remain vulnerable in both countries. In case of Cambodia, rapid growth in garment sector, rise in crop prices and agricultural wages has led to a significant decline in poverty rate from 60% in 2000 to 13.5% in 2015. But still, large share of the population still live just above the national poverty line. And this was what we talked about, the risk of falling back into poverty due to COVID-19. In case of the Philippines, high growth in construction and manufacturing, also in high productivity services like the BPO industry. Important decline in poverty as well in case of the Philippines from 27% in 2006 to 17% in 2018. But limited growth in employment and labor force participation rates. And again, there is a huge heterogeneity across regions in the Philippines. Labor markets in both these countries remain characterized by widespread informality, vulnerable and precarious employment. In case of Cambodia, informality rate estimated at 93% of employment overall, 91% for men, 96% for women. And even when you just look at the non-ag employment, it's 90%. And what this basically means is that people who are in informal employment, they have very limited social protection access to begin with. And overall, generally speaking, in the country, there's very limited social protection coverage. Things have changed because of COVID, as David and others know who are working in Cambodia. Philippines, informal employment lower than Cambodia. It's a richer country, so it's at 56%. This is from the ILO. There has been a rise in wage and salary employment, but also increase in irregular and non-standard forms of employment. And we think that because of the non-standard forms of employment, we have seen a decline in public administration jobs as well. COVID-19 situation, data, and then the methodology. So this is a picture from August. I tried to update it this morning, but the stringency index for Philippines wouldn't show up, so I kind of ended up deleting it. But here you see that on the left-hand side, the yellow line is showing you the stringency index in case of Philippines, in case of Cambodia on the right-hand side. If you look at the right-hand side, the numbers at the axes are different. So what you're looking at is that in case of the Philippines, the lockdown measures were stricter than in case of Cambodia. But of course, most of us know that Philippines has been impacted more heavily than Cambodia in terms of COVID-19. So that played a role. But this has a huge impact later on when we look at our economic and labor market indicators. Data across these two countries varies significantly. In case of Cambodia, we've got annual LFS and other household surveys, but they're relatively old. We don't have access to micro data, and we have mostly relied on imputed time series from ILO database. And in terms of the approach, we have used elasticities-based approach for projecting impact. In case of the Philippines, we've got quarterly LFS for many years, including this year. And what I'll do later on, I'll show you the projected impact versus actual impact. We also have access to microdata thanks to ERCD. Here, for the modeled impact, we use elasticity approach as well, and then we compare that with the actual impact. In terms of methodology, as I alluded to, it uses employment elasticities of growth. We start by estimating point elasticities at the sectoral level to obtain employment impact. And then what we do is we model change in labor force participation rate due to crisis, and we project the labor force. And then after that, you obtain projected unemployment as a residual from the labor force and employment projections. And we also are able to analyze labor reallocation through sectoral shifts in employment and shifts across labor force status. The actual impact, of course, we have the data for actual impact. We can unpack this based on the data we have. So the hypotheses, there are 5 main hypotheses. Just to give you a sense, the first one, like previous crises, the COVID-19 pandemic would result in a decline in employment, particularly across tradable sectors. So manufacturing due to decline in global demand, but also more than previous crises, also for non-tradable sectors like retail, trade, education, due to lockdown measures. The hypothesis 2, the second one we test is like other crises, it would result decline in labor force participation rates, as well as labor reallocation from higher productivity, which are generally formal sectors, to employment in lower productivity, largely informal sectors. The third one we also are able to test with this is that the crisis would have a significant impact on poverty, reversing some of the gains of the past decade. The fourth one we have looked at using this data and approach is that low-skilled workers and other vulnerable groups would be disproportionately affected. And lastly, due to the unprecedented nature and scale of the COVID-19 crisis and corresponding policies, the historical elasticities approach that we normally use to project employment impact might not be actually right. And we see this in case of the Philippines. I'll show you the numbers are quite stark. The model estimate underestimate the actual impact by a huge margin. Employment impact assessment. So here, first, just headline pictures before I get into the sectoral analysis. COVID-19's impact on employment was far worse this time around than during the Great Recession for Cambodia. This picture, I've taken out some of the pessimistic GDP growth scenarios as David Friedman in Cambodia knows. Here, I've just looked at using the IMF's estimates showing the negative real GDP growth of minus 1.6% in 2020. Using that, we see a 0.5% decline in employment in 2020 compared to 2019. In case of the Philippines, the picture is much worse. My apologies for all those lines going down. They're basically different scenarios. Here, I've included the more pessimistic scenario from the government as well. Again, here we see that using the negative real GDP growth projections for 2020 from the IMF, so you've got 3.6% from the IMF. The government's own forecast was 5.5% downturn. So using those estimates, we see a decline of about 1.2 to 1.8% in employment growth. Now let's unpack that a bit further, but I'll just show you this unemployment rate chart, which is also kind of interesting, is that the increase in unemployment rate in those two countries is enormous. If you look at the left-hand side, the unemployment levels and rate for Cambodia, the bar graphs are levels and then the lines are rates. The blue lines, you see the dotted line going up. That's unemployment rate going from 0.7 to 3.2 and then 3.5 in 2021. Of course, those of you who have looked at headline indicators of labor market will tell me, Samir, but that's actually very low unemployment rate. And you would be right in saying that. When you look at an advanced country, of course, if you're looking at a 3.5% unemployment rate, say in a place like Spain, where Christina is, that's good news, right? But in case of a country like Cambodia, well, not so good news, because actually, of course, the unemployment rate doesn't really capture the actual state of the labor market in Cambodia because most people are in informal employment. But nonetheless, even using the numbers we can get in terms of formal employment, we see that, or just the data we have from the government, the LFS from about 10 years ago, even using that number, we see this type of increase, which means that the labor market was impacted heavily. That's sort of, we're inferring that based on this analysis. But I wouldn't put too much of my currency on looking at unemployment rate for a country like Cambodia. In case of the Philippines, we can actually rely a bit more on the unemployment rate as a headline indicator of the labor market. Here we see that unemployment rate soared to 17.7% in April 2020, with around 5 million additional unemployed workers in case of the Philippines. Now, when we look at by sector, so impact of COVID-19 varies by sector in Cambodia. If you look at Cambodia, the top rows, they're all the ones in sort of orange, red color. Most affected sectors in Cambodia in terms of projected employment losses are construction, manufacturing, hotels and restaurants, transport, stores and communications, as well as real estate and business services and financial intermediation. Just to give you a sense, these sectors accounted for approximately 60% of value added and nearly 45% of employment in Cambodia in 2019. When you look at the Philippines, the situation is much worse. And here you get a first taste of the modeled impact versus actual impact. And in the Philippines, most affected sectors are also construction, hotels and restaurants, transport, stores and communication, real estate and business services, but also in education, health, and other services such as public administration. If you look at the three columns that I have here, best case, the worst case, and actual, right? So best case was the IMF, 3.5. The worst case was government, 5.5% GDP decline. And the actual is what we saw. So basically, the first two columns are showing you taking their GDP numbers and using that to model the estimate by sector. Compare that with the actual numbers. And here you see that the actual figures show that the impact has been underestimated using our model estimate. Let's just take an example of construction, for example, right? We estimated a decline of about 439,000 jobs, but as it turns out, in actuality, it's 783,000 jobs have declined in that sector. Similarly, wholesale retail trade and hotels and restaurants, the model estimates were 190,000. We saw 514,000, almost 500,000. And transport, storage, communication story is very similar. And you look at the education, health, and social work, community, social, and personal services, even here, huge decline. The model estimate will tell you 99,000 job would decline because of the crisis, but we saw over 500,000 jobs disappearing in that sector. So again, the actual impact was much larger than the modeled impact. Although some workers who lose their jobs become unemployed, others shift to lower productivity sectors, and others drop out of the labor force altogether. So if you look at the left-hand side, this pie chart for Cambodia, job losses and labor reallocation. So you see that on the left-hand side, the bigger circle, the green slice from that, the bigger circle is referring to out of the estimated 390,000. So there's total 390,000 workers there who would lose their jobs. You take that workers and slice them into different change in their labor force status. You see that some of them go into lower productivity sectors, some become unemployed, some drop out of the labor force. So the shift to lower productivity sectors, actually over 1/3 of workers actually went into lower productivity sectors. Here, the predominant one is agriculture, but a lot of them also became unemployed. On the right-hand side, the table is comparing Cambodia and the Philippines. And if you look at this, workers who lose their job in 2020, right? And as I showed you earlier, in case of Philippines on the right-hand side, we estimated 1.9 million, but as it turns out, it's 3.2 million, looking at actual data. And again, drop out of the labor force, become unemployed, shift to lower productivity sectors. The shifting to lower productivity sectors is interesting because we saw less of that in case of the Philippines, and we saw more of that in case of Cambodia. This is largely due to the stringency of lockdown measures, because in case of Philippines, people couldn't really shift or go to province or work in low productivity sectors as easily. Indeed, actual figures for Philippines over Q1, Q3 confirm a significant drop in labor force participation and labor reallocation towards agriculture. So this didn't happen as it normally would. We would expect this to happen in a crisis, but in case of Philippines, this happened less than we would have expected. I'm just gonna go on to the next one. The pandemic had a significant impact on hours worked, a significant increase in part-time work and in the numbers of those employed but who didn't work. So while many workers lost their jobs, others shifted to part-time work, and a larger number were still employed but didn't work, particularly in the most affected sectors. And if you look at this chart, it is giving you full-time, part-time, and the blue ones are with job but didn't work, right? Because of the enterprises that they work in being closed and whatnot. Sectors most at risk include those where women account for the largest share of employment, particularly among low-skilled, vulnerable workers. And this is a stark finding when we look at this data. The left-hand side, the scatter plot is showing you female share in employment and projected share of net job losses by sector. So the y-axis there is share of net job losses versus baseline, and then the x-axis is female share in employment. So if you look at the sectors, some of the sectors on the right-hand side here, I can't draw a circle like Anuj was doing this morning, but or this afternoon for Manila. But anyway, so you can see the right-hand side there. You see a lot of the sectors where the share of female employment is high have been hugely impacted. So significant impact on women in hotels and restaurants and wholesale and retail trade. High vulnerable employment rates. Vulnerable employment basically means self-employed and unpaid family workers. So here again, a lot of the women are in some of these sectors. They have been impacted due to COVID. Other affected sectors with high female representation are education, other services, and in the case of Cambodia, manufacturing, where manufacturing here is it's basically garment. Men were more affected in construction, transport, tourism, communications, finance, and real estate, and other activities. So poverty impact assessment is basically using working poverty data from the ILO. So here we see that increase in extreme and moderate poverty due to COVID-19 could be worse than Great Recession. COVID-19 is reversing some of the important achievements in terms of poverty reduction over the past decade in Cambodia. And this, as David knows, I think we have some recent estimates on this, but this is basically using working poverty estimates. So the blue line, the orange line you see at the top there, extremely or moderately poor. So you see that the increase in extremely or moderately poor, you see the line going up towards the end there. That's using COVID MEF scenario, which is the Ministry of Economy and Finance, that scenario. But if you look at the other scenario, IMF, the impact is a little bit less worse. In case of Philippines, story is again similar. Pandemic would increase the number of poor people by approximately 700,000 and the number of poor families by 115,000. So again, I'm going to wrap this up because there's a lot going on in this in these slides. But anyway, the main insights are basically COVID-19 pandemic had an unprecedented impact, increase in unemployment rate, decline in labor force participation, drop in hours worked. And of course, these are basically, I guess, answering Emma's question in the survey. And then also the sectors that are more impacted, most impacted employ large shares of low-skilled workers, and they have been impacted in terms of poverty as well. COVID-19 versus previous economic shocks, and this is an interesting finding that kind of quickly wanted to highlight, is that although some displaced workers shifted to agriculture, across the board, lockdown measures prevented large-scale labor reallocation. And this is something that we saw more in the Philippines than in Cambodia. Again, so lastly, of course, we have to look at this a bit more further using new databases and more recent data, but this is for future work, so I'm just going to leave it at this. Thank you. Over to you, Emma.
Okay, thank you very much, Samir. And I think that we can all see why it's important to measure much more than just unemployment in our Southeast Asian economies. I want to make sure that Sunny has enough time to give his presentation on some interesting policy responses from Indonesia. So over to you, please, Sunny.
Thanks, Emma. I think Dulce will be helping with the slide. Just out of solidarity with Samir, I also decided to share the previous template for my presentation. So this is teamwork at its best. Anyway, I will go through the presentation covering basically the response of the Indonesian government and then probably highlight some key issues towards the end. If we can go to the next slide, please. And we can go straight to slide number 3. We don't have to go to the outline. So this, in essence, let's take a step back and start with a bigger macro picture in terms of Indonesia's government's overall response. And you can see there, the total budget was 46.7 billion, and this was more or less divided into 6 categories: public health, MSME incentive, social assistance, enterprise, sectoral and regional, which is meant more for the subnational government, as well as corporate financing. I suppose if you ask about labor market, MSMEs, those would fall within the 2nd and 3rd category, perhaps a little bit in the 4th category as well: MSME incentive, social assistance, and enterprise incentive. So in terms of these programs by the government, the public health program obviously is to control the spread of the pandemic and have better testing and tracing, whereas the PEN, which is commonly known as the National Economic Recovery Program, is to soften the shocks to the poor and vulnerable households via social assistance, as well as counter-cyclical fiscal policy to jumpstart the economy. Next slide, please. I think the next slide should be on the disbursement rates of these various programs. Thank you. So this shows you the disbursement as of October 2020 and some interesting figures. You can see that the MSME incentive and social assistance have done particularly well. In fact, the government have essentially, used existing programs, existing social assistance programs to ramp up assistance. And I think this is, very much in line with Ricardo Hausmann's recommendation that do not start with new programs, start with existing programs. However, they have been a bit slow on the public health, and that has been subject to some criticisms in the press as well as other stakeholders. This is obviously an area that we are closely monitoring as part of the CARES monitoring program and policy dialogue. Next slide, please. Right, so when we talk about the government's response programs, I can sort of broadly categorize them into three areas. One is the Kartu Prakerja, also known as the pre-employment card. The second is on the wage subsidy, which is a fairly new proposal coming out from September 2020. And the third is, well, not really a program as such, but you may have heard about the rather controversial Omnibus law, the Job Creation Act, which was actually signed by the president just a few days ago. Let me start with the pre-employment card or the Kartu Prakerja. So what this program is essentially is to provide a reskilling and skilling of, initially it was supposed to be targeted for youth. That was the original target. So if you look at the original conditions, you must be citizens of the country, below 18 years old, and obviously these are targeting those who are we would consider to be NEET, in the NEET category, meaning not in education or training. And the benefit was really to provide subsidy for training allowance up to the amount of $300, with some incentives for job search allowance, $35, as well as within this whole period of 3 to 4 months, they will be incentivized to fill up surveys just to measure the baseline and the effectiveness of the program, and they get some small incentive for doing this. So this was kind of the original program, which was really targeted for reskilling and skilling of youth to get them into the labor market. And the original budget for this program was 1.3 billion and was meant to benefit 2 million beneficiaries. This program was launched sometime towards late last year. Then, of course, COVID hit, very heavily in March, April in Indonesia. So the government actually repurposed and redesigned this Kartu Prakerja, and you will see the details of the new or Kartu Prakerja 2.0 in the next slide. In this slide, you see that what they've done is essentially move the original pre-employment card for youth into more of a semi-social assistance program. So in Indonesia, they call this semi-bansos, bantuan sosial. So what happens now? If you look at beneficiaries, they're looking not just at youth any longer, but they're looking at people who've been laid off, employees who've been furloughed, or including informal employees and MSMEs, as well, while still retaining a small quota for those who are looking for employment. But interestingly, you see that the benefit column has now greatly changed. And that is why we say that they have now converted this program to a semi-social assistance, reflecting probably the need of this, the urgent need to support livelihoods. And so the online training, the original $300 have now been greatly reduced to $70. This is partly a reflection of the fact that you can't have physical vocational training because obviously due to COVID, you are not supposed to have that sort of face-to-face interaction. So instead, the focus is on online training, which presumably can be obtained at a cheaper rate. So now the subsidy is $70. And as you can see, there's been quite a big change to the original job search allowance. Now they are called Subsistence Allowance, and it runs for 4 months for each applicant. So they get $42 times 4, $168, while still maintaining the effectiveness survey that I discussed in the original design. As far as the revised budget, it has been increased. It is now $2 billion, and the beneficiary that have been included so far is 5 million of them. Interestingly, this program, this Kartu Prakerja pre-employment card, it's really targeting the 5th and 6th decile in terms of poverty. And the logic was that for those in the bottom 40%, they would be assisted through more traditional social assistance programs, such as the conditional cash transfer, the food voucher, sembako, and so forth. So this is looking more at those who have been affected due to COVID and essentially lost their job or have been furloughed and asked to stay at home. Next slide, please. We'll go, I think, to the next program of the government, which is the very recent wage subsidy program. And this is something fairly new. Still, I mean, it has been launched, but I would say that there's still details of this program that requires further clarification. So in this slide, you see the requirements for the wage subsidy program. You need to be citizen, you need to be registered with the Social Assistance Employment Program. They call this BPJS Ketenagakerjaan until June 2020. So you essentially, you must have been registered for quite some time. You can't be a fresh and new registrant. Obviously, due to the fact that this is related to employment, they had to limit this to formal employees. And I'll touch on this in a bit in subsequent slides. They need to have an active bank account and a monthly salary of below $350. So essentially what this program does is provide a direct transfer to the employees at the rate of $42 for 4 consecutive months. And the allocation is, again, $2 billion, and they have benefited around 12.4 million employees. Next slide, please. These are some of the key issues of this wage subsidy program, implementation challenges, if you like. When we talk of wage subsidy, and I think Christina mentioned this earlier when she was moderating the MSME session, and certainly in the case of Philippines, the way I understand it is it's supposed to be linked with employers. The whole objective of a wage subsidy program is to actually subsidize the salary or the wages of the employees so that they are not laid off, so that they are kept in their employment. And so that, that has several benefits. Obviously, on one hand, they don't lose their job. On the other hand, it also allows the MSMEs, the companies, to recover faster, because instead of recruiting new staff when we approach when things and condition improves, they have existing employees on the books. This is not very clear in the case of Indonesia, how much it is linked to employers and how much, whether it is made a condition for the employers that they must keep the employees on the books in order to qualify for this wage subsidy. So that's something that I think we need to look into a bit more detail and have a discussion with the government. Other challenges include data completeness. That's essential in any social assistance program or employment labor market programs. You need reliable data. There have been delays in bank processing and reporting. So for instance, when the government make a transfer to the bank, they don't get that loop, the feedback loop from the banks that they've received the money and the money has been transferred to the employees. Invalid account numbers, delays in receiving payments. So there have been reported cases of successful applicants not getting the monthly allowance or monthly subsidy on time. And also the last point is what happens to the informal workers. Since this is based on those who have registered with the Social Assistance Ketenagakerjaan, it excludes informal workers. And obviously in the case of Indonesia, as many other ASEAN countries, there is a sizable number of informal workers. So they are by default excluded from this program. Next slide, please. This is on the Omnibus Law, Job Creation Act, very, very controversial in Indonesia. And there have been a lot of, if you read the news in Jakarta Post and so forth, a lot of demonstrations on this particular law. It was recently signed by the president, was passed by the parliament on 5th October, signed by the president on 2nd November. This was resulted in massive demonstration, largely led by the trade unions, the union groups. And, there's been even destruction of some properties in Jakarta, including the MRT station opposite of the ADB office in Jakarta. So what is the Omnibus Law? It essentially tries to revise, well, not tries, it does revise 73 existing laws on various issues, one of them being the labor law of 2003. what is important to understand is that this omnibus law also covers other issues such as environment and enabling business environment. But that's not something we will discuss today. For the labor market, the section focusing on the labor market, the main objective is to lower the cost of the labor market, make it more flexible to increase foreign investments. And the key issues, as I mentioned, is to increase flexibility as well as to reduce severance pay of employees when they go through this process. So you can see the table that I got from a publication we have that, earlier. You can see some of the changes made in this omnibus law. I don't think I have to go into details on this table, but for instance, just to give an example, one of the flexibility introduced through the omnibus law is that for fixed-term contract, there's no more maximum limit of 3 years for fixed-term contract, and also for the indefinite-term contract, you had the dismissal for rule violations that originally required 3 warning letters and 6-month intervals have been removed. So this gives more flexibility to employers. As far as the severance pay, this was probably one of the most controversial areas of the law. You can see there that Indonesia actually has I think there was a World Bank study that said that Indonesia has the 3rd highest severance pay in the world. I can't remember the other 2 countries. I think it was Mauritius and maybe Sierra Leone, if I'm not mistaken. So for instance, for an employee that, whose contract has been terminated, they can get, and if assuming you've been working for 8 to 9 years, you can get actually 24.2 months worth of compensation. That number increases exponentially. So if you've been working for 24 years plus, you can get actually 32 months of severance pay. Now you can imagine with this huge amount, obviously it's a disincentive for employers. It makes the labor market very flexible. And as Khatib Basri mentioned in one of his brilliant articles, it is actually a tax on the unemployed because it makes it more difficult for companies to lay off ineffective workers and get new workers into the labor market. So the omnibus law, what it does is it reduces some of these high numbers, particularly the doubling of the severance pay, as well as the relocation fees of 15%. Government is supposed to set up a separate fund and sort of supplement the reduced amount that the employers and private sector will be providing. So the combination of the government funding and the employers funding will hopefully bring it up to a more manageable level in terms of severance pay in Indonesia. Next slide, please. I'd just like to end the presentation on what ADB is doing in Indonesia. This is, many of you will know this. I'm sure Christina knows this very well. The Job Start program that was started originally in the Philippines. It is something that we are trying to bring to Indonesia with, we've done the basic preparation in Makassar and Bandung, but obviously, due to the pandemic, a lot of things had to be postponed. Certainly the counseling, the face-to-face counseling and the life skills training have to be retaught because the applicants can no longer gather within a classroom setting for this counseling or life skills training. But what is interesting about the Job Start program is, if you look, is that at different points of the cycle, we do a job matching with the private sector. So we try to connect applicants to enterprises, to private sector who have agreed to become partners of Job Start. So when they first come into the system, applicants, they get life skills training. This essentially means, how to build teamwork, how to write a CV, how to attend interviews, those kind of trainings that sometimes, even those who finish high school don't really have those kind of skills. And they get some form of career guidance by counseling. You can see that face-to-face. What we're trying to do now is trying to convert that guidance counseling to an online format. Not the easiest of things to do, but that's something we hope to begin implementing in Q1 next year. And then after they finish the life skills training and the career guidance, we try to do job matching. If they're ready, great. If they're not, then we go to the second phase, which is the technical training. And again, here we have difficulties in terms of vocational technical training due to the pandemic. And if, after the technical training, we try to do another matching and we see the result. And finally, we have a proposed internship program under the government Presidential Regulation 45/2019. So it is hoped that through this 3 interventions, starting from the life skills training to the technical training and the internship, a sizable number of applicants who go through the Job Start program will find employment at the end of the cycle. And if they don't, then we have to think of alternate exit pathways. For instance, going back to education or doing some self-entrepreneurship. So that's a program that we are trying to implement in Indonesia, and we hope to have a full rollout in 2021. I think that's the last slide, and happy to end the presentation here and get any Q&A from the crowd. Thank you very much.
I think you're mute.
You were just now, Christina. Now we can hear you. But now we can't again.
No, but I think Emma
Oh,
is...
Emma, sorry,
Emma is mute. Yeah.
Emma is on mute. Right, now you're okay.
Sorry,
Emma.
for some reason the button is not clicking on and off very well. Sunny and Samir, I have been asked by Dulcie to please turn on your videos so that we could have, which has also triggered me to temporarily take off my dressing gown and turn my video on.
Sorry about that. I wasn't sure whether the bandwidth will be sufficient for video and presentation.
Dulcie, this is what you wanted?
But you can see I'm clearly not wearing my pajamas.
And meanwhile,
thank you. Is that not a pajama? Somebody.
So meanwhile, Hannah is also going to be posting the results of our poll in the chat window. And I did see some preliminary results. I think we're waiting for a bit of drum roll from Hannah. Oh, here we go. Okay. So question number 1 was a bit of a trick question, actually. I think so I allowed the audience to select all that apply, and I was asking which key indicators of the labour market are likely to be impacted by COVID. The correct answer is all of them. All of you selected unemployment, and that's the typical indicator that we would think of as demonstrating something's going on in the labour market. But in the context of COVID, as we heard from our 2 presenters, many people have suffered through work time reduction, and that's reflected in working less hours. So that was number 2. The second area where people might be impacting is if they do lose their job in the informal economy and they don't have access to social protection or other means for support, they may take up employment in agriculture or in the informal economy. If you take this to the extreme, people can resort to things like self-exploitation in order to be able to generate enough income to earn a livelihood to support their families. And by that, I don't mean prostitution, Sunny. I mean, taking up work that's below a level of remuneration that you would normally deem appropriate. Second is wage growth. What we've seen in Indonesia, the wage statistics came out last Thursday. We've seen wages stagnating, and I think that that's very important. We've also seen inflation be quite low, so that could potentially offset wage growth, but wage stagnation, I think, is something that we'll see this year and probably in the medium term as well. We have also seen people dropping out of the labour force. As people lose their jobs, they become economically inactive because there's a lot of people who think, what's the point? The cost of job search is too high. So then they withdraw from the labour market altogether. And of course, education attainment, I think, is going to be another issue coming up. We have seen people shifting to online learning, and then also families potentially having reduced income, which may then see families resort to taking their kids out of school temporarily or permanently so that they can earn an income to support their families. So important for us to be monitoring all of those variables. I think education quality will also be very important to keep a track on, but that's measured through the OECD PISA survey. Okay, number 2, while everybody's thinking of questions, I want to see some raised hands. Number 2, what are the top 3 policy instruments that are likely to be most effective in mitigating the short-term impacts of health and economic impacts of COVID? So this was a little bit of a trick question as well, because I put in the phrase short term. If we were thinking about medium-term policies, then perhaps a training subsidy might become very appropriate over the next, say, 2, 3, 5 years. But in the short term, a wage subsidy is going to be something that's very helpful, and that's been selected by most of you. We've got a tie for second place on cash for work programs, unemployment insurance, and tax relief to enterprises. So that's quite interesting. Cash for work programs I do find to be very interesting in the context of a pandemic. A lot of countries have rolled them out as part of crisis response programs. But they're a little bit problematic because you have to make sure that occupational health and safety standards are in place. A lot of cash for work programs do tend to be revolving around labour-intensive road construction, for example, or construction of irrigation in rural areas. It can be a little bit difficult to ensure appropriate occupational health and safety standards on those types of sites. Very interesting to see that unemployment insurance is a more popular option over severance payments. Unemployment insurance, of course, being administered typically through a fund, whereas severance payments are directly provided by enterprises themselves. Both of them are payments towards the workers, but one is obviously coming at the direct expense of an enterprise and probably felt immediately by an enterprise that's already under stress, whereas the other is through a managed fund, which is specifically designed for the purpose of supporting people when they become unemployed. Tax relief to enterprises, I think that we've already heard a lot about tax relief and the importance of that for enterprises from Shige's presentation earlier. Other things to highlight, I think that unemployment health insurance is probably something that's very, very essential that we're all learning about now. And things like provision of protective equipment for workers that are in close vicinity. So with the overview of the results, I would like to invite any questions from the floor. For some reason I'm finding it difficult to see the questions or people who've got their hand up. Anybody would like to step in with a question? Yeah, I can't see any hands up at this stage. I'll invite Sunny and Samir to give any last comments before we hand over to Bernard and DG for final comments.
Emma, I think we have a question from DG in the chat box. Thank you. Emma, you're on mute.
Sorry, the mute button is having a bit of a lag. So we've got a question from Christina, and I'll read out DG's question, and then we'll have Sunny and Samir respond and hand over directly to Bernard. So Sunny, is there any new post-COVID thinking on how to reduce the level of informality in the economy? Okay, this question is relevant for not only Indonesia, but the other economies in Southeast Asia as well. Hand over to Christina, please, for your question. Ibu Christina.
Okay, thanks, Emma. Yeah, this is regarding the wage subsidy. Basically, the wage subsidy in the Philippines incentivizes the employers to retain the working relationship, the attachment with the employees, instead of laying them off. So this allows enterprises to quickly restart their commercial operations once the lockdown is lifted, no? And then afterwards. So they don't have to spend search time and incur costs rehiring workers again. So this is one of the main drivers of a wage subsidy program. In addition to provide income stability for employees during the lockdown period. So it helps them, getting back into, it's a transition for them during the lockdown period and the hardest part of the pandemic. Without the wage subsidy, many employees may experience wage cuts, reduced work hours, etc. And in some instances, even have unpaid leave once the paid leave is consumed. So I'm really wondering why Indonesia doesn't embrace this concept of retaining the employees, because for me it's one of the main principles behind a wage subsidy program. So I wonder if Sunny or even you, Emma, can elaborate on this thinking, because I cannot get the rationale. Thank you.
I actually have the same question, Christina. So it's not clear from what we've seen from the government in terms of what we've seen in terms of the presentation and the discussion, the link to employers and how that would be essentially, like you say, to encourage employees to retain employees. One possibility I can think of is just that Indonesia came out with this wage subsidy proposal rather late in the game, I would say. I mean, it was recently launched in September, whereas if we look at Philippines, I think it was launched sometime in March, April, similar with other countries in the region. So unfortunately, I think, as we approach September, October, a lot of the employees have already been laid off, I think. So that may be one reason. The other may just be the government's just focus on livelihoods and social assistance and use the wage subsidy program as another form of social assistance. But I'll be happy to hear whether Emma, Samir has any views on this. But certainly the wage subsidy program in Indonesia is new, and it's not very clear on the linkage to employers.
Samir, I'll give you the floor before we wrap up.
Sure, thank you, Emma. I think on the wage subsidy, Christina, I don't know what the main logic is, so I can't really answer your question. But on the analysis, I think there's a comment from David and also Sophia. So basically, first, Sophia, in terms of diversification, of course, David can answer this even better than I can. But at the end of the day, diversification is what we ought to highlight for the broader economy itself in Cambodia. And we have seen this, if you look at the data by different value added by sectors, you already see this as some of the sectors that are growing, for example, even bicycle parts or wire manufacturing. So manufacturing away from just garment is increasing as well. And the over-reliance on tourism is another issue. And of course, here, you are always open to exogenous shocks like COVID-19. So at the end of the day, I think diversification is important. In terms of analysis itself, David, the work we are doing, this is basically the Cambodia work was for CIPRO, as you know, and Philippines work is for the TVET study. So I have a couple of folks who who are working on this, co-authors on this work. We are expanding this analysis to include other countries in Southeast Asia. So we'll include Indonesia and other countries as well. So hopefully next year we'll have a study that looks at Southeast Asia, generally speaking. So if we have access to that data that you mentioned, you and Sophia, in the chat box, please do let me know, and then we can actually use that data to do the analysis. Over to you, Emma.
Thank you. Christina, I see that your hand is still raised. I assume that that's still raised from previous. Okay. Great. So just a brief comment following on from Sunny and Samir on informality and usage of the wage subsidy. I have two reasons perhaps why Indonesia hasn't rolled out that particular program. One is related to usage or accountability in use of public funds. I know that around the global financial crisis, this was a big issue and there was a huge scandal. So I think that perhaps public officials are especially sensitive to ensuring accountability in usage of public funds. And the second comes a little bit from our discussion with the private sector when we were having our policy subcommittee meetings associated with the Indonesia Cares program. And the private sector mentioned that they needed support for employee retention, and they were very interested in public health measures, including suppression policies, as part of the overall response. But they didn't highlight in the dialogue, from my memory, that they were looking specifically at a wage subsidy proposal. I do remember private sector employers that have the capacity to lobby government were very much focusing on tax relief. And tax relief is definitely reflected in Indonesia's public health and economic recovery program. So I assume that this reflects the preferences of the private sector for their support. On DG's questions on new measures to support informality or transition from the informal to formal economy, I would say that there's the innovation that we've seen in public policy lately relates to new support for students, teachers, university students for using internet. And I find that to be very important or very interesting in terms of quality of education and improving access, which is, if it's rolled out effectively, could be of benefit for productivity and in continuity in education in the future. So I'll stop here, and thank you very much to Samir and Sunny for all the thought that you've put into your presentations today. I'm sure the audience is most grateful for your sharing.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Emma and to Samir and Sunny. Great presentation, and I see your fan club is growing rapidly, and we are really glad to see that there's so much interest in the work that is being presented. I'm not going to be slightly over the schedule, but generally we basically kept well to the time and everything. So very happy. I think we can all congratulate ourselves, and let's all give applause both to ourselves for great participation, and of course to our moderator and speaker for taking us through such a wonderful intellectual journey in the afternoon. DG, do you want to say something? Okay, maybe DG will come in. But in the meantime, I'll just say, today we are just at the day one. We have another day of great ideas and issues that will be discussed and presented. So if you can, for tomorrow, I would like to invite you all to join us at 9 o'clock in the morning, where we will have a session on protecting the poor. It's a short session from 9 to 10. And then we'll continue again at the same time tomorrow afternoon for 2 more sessions. So we have 3 sessions. It's just that we have one session in the morning to accommodate some people who are in North America. And then afternoon session, we'll be looking at the control measures. One session will be on the impact of the control measures on how we control COVID, basically. And then the other measure is on the use of big data and GIS. So interesting things, and looking forward, and I'm sure all you will as well. So if DG is not saying anything, I will say goodbye and thank you very much for your great participation today. Oh, and before I forget, we should give a thanks to the people who have been working tirelessly in the virtual background. Dulce, Sheila, Hannah, who has been, working very hard to make sure everything went smoothly. Presentations are uploaded, polls are answered, polls are presented. So thank you very much. Let's give them a big applause. They've been, working very hard in the background.
Well done, well done.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you, everybody.
So I think that's it for today, and see you all tomorrow.
Thanks, Bernard. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Bernard.
Thank you. Thank you all.